We've had our fair share of clients at Hussey Coding Limited, with a company behind Developer Connection, in case you didn't know. And as I'm sure you have also found, in some cases it can be hard to create a solid working relationship with client and developer firmly on the same page, with everything from the details of the project spec to what's on the invoice. If you manage to get to this point, then you have a highly productive, effective team where both client and developer work fluidly together to produce a great end result. Here, the client gives the developer enough room to work effectively, and the developer keeps the client in a loop with regular updates. Today's post discusses some of the principles we've found to work wonders in getting to this point. Without a doubt, you are going to find one principle is paramount in the smooth and successful running of a project where both client and developer are happy. That principle is trust. And in this post, we'll be looking at ways in which you can build trust in a new working relationship, but also discussing signs that might indicate the trust you need is not there yet, or if it was, it's breaking down. The first recommendation is that, in the same way as you would with any relationship, take things slow at the start of a new working relationship so that both parties can get a feel for how the other works. The main area where trust needs to be built is with the client trusting the developer. Like with any industry, there are unfortunately both good and bad developers, with bad developers very much being able to talk the talk but not really able to back this up with effective development skills. At the start, the client will rightly be looking to make sure they're working with someone who is a good fit for their business and has the skills they need. So expect trust to take some time to build. You might know that you have the skills and experience to complete the client's project to a great standard, but you need to convince the client of that by delivering great results, which demonstrates that skill and experience. The flip side of this, of course, is that you can have both good and bad clients. As a developer, you want a client who is willing to put enough trust in you that when it comes to invoicing, while they might not understand all the ins and outs of the work you've done, and why should they, after all, that's why they hired you, they do trust that what's on the invoice is an accurate representation of the work that has been completed and the time it has taken. Achieving this goes hand in hand with maintaining good communication with the client, and sometimes this can be about the developer managing expectations at the start of the project. From a client perspective, there may be less immediately obvious progress in terms of visually seeing changes at the beginning compared to, say, when a theme begins to be built and the changes are very visual. As a developer, as long as you are clear with the client about the work that is happening and has been done for an invoice, then that first invoice shouldn't be a problem. But if the client suddenly gets landed with a sizable invoice when from their perspective there still isn't much to see, it could indicate a lack of communication from developer to client on the work done before sending the invoice. In other cases, however, it might be that the client just has an unrealistically low expectation of the costs involved in working on the project, and this is never a great start for the developer. For these and a great many more reasons, our recommendation is that in the first period of the project, the developer completes just a relatively small section of work and then invoices the client. It's normal for the client to have some fair questions about what they're being asked to pay for in these early stages. This is just part of building trust. But if the client is essentially happy to pay for the work done and hasn't balked at the cost, then some trust has already been built there and both parties are likely to be off to a good start. But sometimes these early stages of a project can give clear signs that it may not be all smooth sailing. From a client perspective, it's a good idea to do a little probing into the early work the developer has done for you. So we recommend picking one or two specific things the developer has worked on and asking them to explain how the changes they've done work exactly from an out of interest point of view. If they're able to explain it to you in plain English such that you then understand that change, then that is a great sign. We love this quote at Developer Connection: if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. And that was said by Albert Einstein. Over and over again, we've found it to be true that the better the understanding and experience you have of something, the more easily you can simplify it in your own mind, and so the more easily you can explain it in simplified terms to someone who has no in-depth understanding in that field. So applied to this, if a developer is able to explain a change they've made in terms that are understandable by anyone, there's a good chance they have a high level of expertise in development, as they are able to see and understand the wider picture of the changes they have made. If on the other hand they explain it by giving you a bunch of development terms and jargon you don't understand, then be wary. The likelihood is the end product you're delivered, while it might work as intended, just won't be following best practices, and this is highly likely to cost you money further down the line to fix the bad code that was written. They're also likely to be spending a good portion of their time finding out how to actually complete the task, maybe even reusing someone else's code they don't entirely understand, also known as copy and paste coder, which will cost you more money in development time. From a developer perspective, there are a few things you can look out for in these early stages as well. You of course always hope that you get a client who will take you on, give you a project to do and just let you get on with it, trusting that you're doing the job well as you keep them regularly informed. The reality is that this is actually rarely the case, and often a client will understandably want to be more involved in how the work proceeds, particularly at the start, but this can sometimes be taken to extremes. It's your job as a developer to give the client all the tools they need to be able to see and track work as it progresses, and understand the time required and spent on tasks. For instance, you want to give the client access to a ticketing system, a staging environment to review and improve code changes before they go to production, access to the repo just in case they want to dig a bit deeper, and in here you can also link commits of your code changes to tickets so it's easy to reference them. You'll also want to give them easy access to ask you questions or get updates, etc. So you're basically looking to give the client everything they need to track the progress of the project in as much detail as they want to. But sometimes this kind of setup is not enough to satisfy the client's communication requirements, and there are signs you can look out for which can be a strong indicator that building trust with the client is going to be hard. It could also indicate that the working relationship could break down over time. If the client is an experienced project manager, they will understand the time and financial commitments of developing a store. If they are not, however, you may find they approach the project with unrealistic expectations around time and cost. So any scenarios like the following could be cause for concern from a developer perspective. So for instance, the client wants access to your time tracking software so they can see and question exactly how long every task is taken. So it's not about the client having a general overview of the time spent in the project. This is micromanaging every expenditure. The client should be asking questions more like, how's progress with the functionality from ticket XYZ, rather than how long have you spent on ticket XYZ, which would indicate they're only really concerned with cost. They might also want you to use software which takes screenshots as you work for full accountability. I'll tell you right now, many developers find screenshots while they work highly intrusive, and that's why at Hussey Coding Limited, right from the start, we've used Paymo for time tracking, which deliberately steers clear of using screen capture. If there's trust, you don't need to see the developer's screen as they work. They'll be happy to see what you've been doing in what you deliver. You're asked to give full information on how long every task, even the smallest, shortest tickets, will take, and in some cases require completion and sign off before payment is even considered. So this is an indication of a client who has little experience or knowledge of what's involved in development. Any developer knows that requiring completion and sign off of all work before invoicing is totally unworkable, purely from an I need to pay the bills point of view. Often in these cases, when you discuss a task with a client, you can quickly recognise unrealistic client expectations for the completion time of tasks. Another point is that the client wants regular phone calls just to check on progress, and this will be outside of any regular Scrum or other team-based calls. Phone calls when they are needed are not a problem, but good ticket updates should negate the need to have regular phone calls discussing project requirements. Plus, what gets discussed on phone calls often gets forgotten, so steer clear of nailing down any details around project specs on a phone call. While I'm sure it's not the case every time, we have often found working relationships to be more strained when regular check-in phone calls form part of the daily work routine. It's not only disruptive to the developer who may be working on that down the rabbit hole, really complex problem and really just needs to concentrate, but it also puts them under unnecessary pressure, which actually hinders rather than helps productivity. If you come across these kinds of things, then you could very well be at the start of a trust issue, which may end up derailing the entire project given enough time. So as a developer, look out for signs of project micromanagement after the initial period of work. Ultimately, developers, don't undersell yourself. You've spent countless hours and years perfecting your skills, and what you charge is a fair reflection of the skills and experience you have. Situations like the above can be a strong indicator that the client is going to push for you to undersell. You may be happy to negotiate on cost, but remember that early decision will be a permanent one. So if you're willing to cut your costs, it's unlikely the client will ever agree to pay full price for any of the work you do. This is often considered to be one of the harder ones, but at some point both client and developer are going to need to be open about the money side of the project. So do it at the start. If you don't discuss the money side before it comes to sending the first invoice, there is likely to be friction and pushback from both parties when that first invoice is sent. You want to get to the point where the client is clear and happy about the kind of figure they can expect to see when that invoice comes through, and the developer doesn't feel apprehensive about sending invoices in case of pushback from the client. As a developer, you never want to be in a situation where the client feels they need to negotiate on costs to make the invoice more palatable, and openness from both client and developer is key to reducing the chance of this eventuality. Make sure the following points are discussed early on. So you should talk about the client's overall project budget. This doesn't have to be an exact figure, but it should as a minimum give you an indication of, if we're getting close to this figure, then I'm going to get concerned if there's quite a bit still left to do. You should also talk about a ballpark estimation of development costs for the entire project. Again, this doesn't have to be in any way an exact figure, but a best guess will let you know if client and developer are on the same page or if cost expectations are very different. You should discuss money as fully as is required to make sure one key understanding is in place, and that is that the cost of development is realistically never cut and dry. This is really for two reasons. Firstly, the spec always changes and evolves over the course of the project, and secondly, development can be highly complex and it's just not possible to predict with absolute accuracy how long development will take for a task of any complexity. You will rarely, if ever, take on a project where the final product exactly matches the initial spec The spec will always have evolved and changed over time. So the developer can, by all means, give estimates to the best of their ability, but this shouldn't be considered a quote by the client, and it should be anticipated that this or an additional features may be added, or that the development time may be more or less than the developer estimated. As a developer, you might find that the client pushes for a fixed price for your work, but we would advise against working at a fixed price for primarily a couple of reasons. The vast majority, firstly, of the time, either the client will end up paying too much or the developer will end up underselling themselves, neither of which is a good outcome. With a fixed price, the client knows exactly what they're going to be spending. However, in this situation, the quality of the developer's work will most definitely be compromised, as they will always be watching the clock to see how much more time they can spend on each task. The result of this will regularly be a lower quality end product, because the developer hasn't had the time to complete all tickets to the best standard. Working at a fixed price has the danger of making for a considerably poorer working relationship, because the developer doesn't have the freedom they need to do the work well. Yes, there are cases where the overall project cost may be higher, but so will the quality of the product. Plus, the working relationship will be that much stronger because the developer will recognise the client has put trust in them by allowing them to work at an hourly rate rather than a fixed price. So if you quickly come to blows on project costs, or either party are holding back details on this front, our advice is that the working relationship probably isn't right. Telling a developer the project budget doesn't mean they'll work up to that budget in order to get the most money from the project. It means they'll be working to come in as much below that budget as is practical. Also, with knowledge of the overall budget, they will tailor the way they work and the time they spend on each task to suit. One way in which you can make this immediately much easier is for clients to create your project with us at Developer Connection, and in doing that you can add the budget to the project spec, giving you access to the estimated development cost calculator. So when developers get matched to your project, they will immediately have clarity on project costs by being able to see the budget you defined, and developers should subscribe to our service and then set an hourly rate as part of their developer profile. Then when getting matched to projects, the client will have immediate visibility of all developers' hourly rates. Also, with a project budget defined, only the developers with the desired rates are matched to projects anyway. So this is the great and easy way to be upfront from the start without the need for that awkward first conversation on costs. While often this doesn't happen, it's a great idea for both client and developer to sign a simple contract whose content should revolve around the discussions from before work actually started. It shouldn't be a boilerplate document, it should be tailored specifically to that client-developer relationship according to the discussions already had. It should be equally balanced and not overly complex. It's really just a written and signed confirmation that both parties are on the same page before work starts in earnest, and it's a good idea to cover things like invoicing regularity, how the client will be charged, so will it be an hourly job or a fixed rate, whether there is scope for negotiation on invoiced project costs, who owns the assets and does this transfer between parties, if so when does that happen. And it's a good idea to add a get out clause with final settling agreement decided, just in case something should come up that is unresolvable, although that is very rare for that to happen. You basically want to cover off the areas which can potentially cause friction between client and developer, so that if some disagreement does arrive, you already have something in place detailing how that can be resolved. It's likely that the content that needs to be in a document will become clear during discussions, but having a document like this aims to give peace of mind to both parties from the start. So if you find yourself in a situation where something hasn't quite gone to plan, the agreement you should follow has things to resolve those issues already. This is a pretty obvious one, but boils down to the fact that the clearer the communication is between client and developer, the less chance there is for miscommunication. Failure to communicate clearly, particularly in the area of detail around a project spec and what exactly is both requested by the client and determined as possible by the developer, results in assumptions being made by both parties. If you feel as a developer you are in a way assuming certain requirements for a task, get clarity from the client before you start any work. The onus here is, however, on both parties to ensure there are no assumptions made about the project details. Clients should be fully and clearly fleshing out the requirements for every ticket before it even gets assigned to the developer, but the developer should also request clarity where anything is still not clear. Clear communication results in the developer delivering exactly the product the client was after without any misfires with incorrectly built functionality because the requirements weren't clear, and this reduces the possibility of creating unneeded friction between client and developer. Delivering exactly what the client requested is also a great way to build trust, as the client then knows you really understand their project and what they're trying to achieve. It doesn't instill confidence in the client if, as a developer, you're hard to get hold of. Instead, give the client an easy, quick way to get hold of you that they can be sure works every time. Often just seeing that I'm online green dot next to your Skype or similar and seeing those ticket updates coming through is enough. It's not about giving the client a chance to go over the top with how much they contact you. It's just about giving them an easy and available way to get hold of you and making sure that they're aware that you're there when you need them. Failing to make yourself properly available to a client will result in a loss of trust and will ultimately, very likely, push the client away to find a developer who has more interest in their project. But by the same token, clients should also make sure they are ready available to the developer. So feeling like you are working for an unseen employer can make you question the value of the project you're working on. How dedicated actually is a client to their product? Do they care about the spec detail of this ticket that I need to discuss with them? Will my invoice actually be paid when I send it? So make yourself available and to the developer and to the client, even though the likelihood is you won't need to contact much outside of your normal updates at all. Hopefully this blog post covers some genuinely useful points in building a strong and lasting working relationship between client and developer. And if you want to connect with your next valued e-commerce developer or client, then create your project or get your developer subscription with us today at developerconnection.co.uk.